telegram arrived at 8 minutes past dawn, and Delia Dalton read it 3 times before her hand stopped shaking. Your payment is 60 days overdue. Final notice. Cottonwood Ranch deed transfers to Silas Cade, unless full sum received by month end. She pressed her palms flat against the telegraph desk and felt the worn wood grain under her fingertips, solid and real, while everything else tilted sideways. $300. She did not have $300. She did not have 30. The telegraph office brought in barely enough to keep the lamp oil stocked, and the stove fed through winter. Her father's ranch, the one he had lost in a card game to a man who called himself a businessman, but ran half the vice trade from Cheyenne to Silver Pass, would be gone in 28 days, unless she found money she did not have, and never would. The door swung open without a knock, and Sheriff Lucian Thornton stepped inside, filling the narrow frame with trail dust and exhaustion. Delia folded the telegram in half and tucked it under the ledger before he could see her hands tremble. "Morning, Miss Dalton," he said, and his voice had the rough edge of a man who had not slept. She nodded once, stiff and formal, because everyone in Silver Pass knew that the sheriff had been called to the mayor's office twice this week, and rumors moved faster than telegraph wire in a town this size. She had heard the words embezzlement, missing funds, internal investigation. She had also heard the words frame-up and rival claim, depending on who was talking and how much whiskey they had poured first. Lucian set his hat on the corner of her desk, and the brim left a faint dust print on the wood. "I need to send a wire," he said, "to the territorial marshal in Laramie. I need it sent now, and I need it sent discreet." Delia pulled a blank form toward her and dipped her pen. "Go ahead." He gave her the message in clipped phrases, each word deliberate. Request independent audit of Silver Pass municipal accounts. Suspect tampering. Evidence en route. She wrote it down in her cleanest hand, blotted the ink, and counted the words. That will be $1.20. He reached into his vest pocket, and his expression did not change, but his hand came out empty. He tried the other pocket, then his jacket. Then he looked at her with eyes that had seen too many long nights, and said, "I am good for it. I will bring it by this afternoon." Delia set the pen down. The wire does not go out until the fee is paid. That is the rule. Lucian leaned forward, bracing one hand on the edge of her desk, close enough that she could see the line of his jaw tighten. "Miss Dalton, if that wire does not go out in the next 10 minutes, I will be arrested by noon on charges I did not earn. Someone in this town has been moving money, and they have been moving it under my name. I need that audit request filed before the circuit judge arrives tomorrow. I need my name clear." Delia felt the weight of the telegram still hidden under the ledger. 28 days and $300 pressing against her ribs like a knife. She looked at Lucian Thornton and saw a man who had worn the star in Silver Pass for 3 years without bending, who had walked into saloon brawls and range disputes and claimed jumper camps with nothing but his word and his nerve, and who now stood in her office asking for trust he could not pay for. She thought about the ranch deed, about her father's name on a piece of paper that would become someone else's property if she did not find a miracle. She thought about the fact that Silas Cade owned the land office, the freight company, and half the whiskey trade, and that he had made it clear more than once that he expected cooperation from anyone who owed him money. She thought about the fact that the only thing standing between Cade and total control of Silver Pass was a sheriff who did not take bribes and did not look away. She thought about all of that in the span of 3 heartbeats. And then she said, "I will send your wire. But you owe me more than $1.20 now." Lucian straightened, and something careful moved behind his eyes. "Name it." Delia folded her hands on top of the desk, so he would not see them shake. "I need $300 in 28 days, or I lose my father's ranch to Silas Cade. I cannot get a loan, because every bank within 2 territories knows I have no collateral and no income beyond this office. But if I were married to the sheriff of Silver Pass, that would change. Cade would not dare press a claim against the sheriff's wife. The land office would hesitate. I would have time to find another way." The silence in the room stretched long enough that she could hear the clock tick on the wall, could hear the wind push against the window frame, could hear her own pulse hammer in her throat. Lucian did not move. "You are asking me to marry you." She met his eyes and did not blink. "I am asking you to marry me in name and public record long enough to make Silas Cade back off, and give you a wife who can testify on your behalf if this frame-up goes to trial. A marriage bargain. You get an alibi witness who has access to town records and telegraph traffic. I get protection and time." Lucian turned and walked 3 steps toward the door, and for a moment Delia thought he would leave, thought she had miscalculated the one desperate play she had left. But he stopped with his back to her and said, "If I say yes, this becomes real in the eyes of the law and the town. You understand that?" She did. "If I say yes," he continued, "you are tied to a man who might be in a cell by tomorrow night. Or worse. You are betting everything on the idea that I am not the thief they say I am." She heard the exhaustion in his voice, the edge of something that sounded like shame or anger or both. She said, "I am betting on the fact that Silas Cade wants you gone, and that means you are in his way. That is enough for me." Lucian turned back around. His face was unreadable, all hard lines and shadows. "When do you need an answer?" "Now," Delia said, "before the wire goes out. Because if you say no, I send it anyway, and we part as debtor and creditor. If you say yes, I send it as your wife, and we stand together when the judge gets here." They were married in the Silver Pass Chapel at 2 o'clock that afternoon by a preacher who asked no questions and recorded the union in a ledger that smelled of leather and lamp oil. Delia wore the same cream blouse and skirt she had worked in that morning. Lucian wore his badge and his dust and a wedding band that had belonged to his father, a thin circle of tarnished silver that he slipped onto her finger without ceremony or smile. The preacher said the words. Delia said "I do" in a voice that did not waver. Lucian said "I do" in a voice that sounded like a man taking an oath before a judge. They did not kiss. They signed the paper, and the preacher handed Lucian a folded certificate. And then it was done. "Delia Thornton," the preacher said, writing her new name in careful script. "May the Lord bless this union." Delia felt the weight of the ring on her hand, foreign and cold, and thought about the telegram she had sent that morning on her new husband's behalf, about the 27 days she had left, about the fact that she had just married a man she barely knew in order to survive. Lucian offered his arm, stiff and formal, and she took it because that was what a wife would do. They walked out of the chapel into the bright afternoon, and she felt the eyes of Silver Pass on them before they reached the bottom step. The town knew by nightfall. Delia had expected gossip, but she had not expected the speed or the shape it took. By the time she locked the Telegraph office and walked the 3 blocks to the boarding house where she rented a room, She had been stopped twice by women who smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes, and once by a man who tipped his hat and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Thornton," in a tone that suggested he was not sure whether to offer sympathy or suspicion. She climbed the stairs to her room, shut the door, and leaned against it, letting the silence settle. The ring was still on her finger. She had not taken it off. She was not sure she should. This was a performance now, and every detail mattered. A knock came at the door an hour later, firm and deliberate. She opened it to find Lucian standing in the dim hallway, hat in hand, coat dusty, face unreadable. "I brought your things," he said, and gestured to a small travel trunk at his feet. "You are moving into the house behind the jail tonight. People will expect it. A wife does not live separately from her husband, not if the marriage is meant to be believed." The house was smaller than she had expected. One room with a stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed shoved against the back wall. Lucian set her trunk down near the door and said, "You take the bed. I will sleep in the office." She shook her head. "If anyone checks, they need to see evidence we are living as husband and wife. You take the bed. I will take the floor with a blanket." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving across his face. "This is not what you signed up for." She met his eyes. "I signed up to survive, Sheriff. I can sleep on a floor." He exhaled slowly, then nodded. "We split it. You take the bed until midnight. I take it after. We trade off. No one sleeps on the floor." She agreed because it was practical, because arguing would waste time they did not have, and because there was something in his voice that told her this mattered to him, some line he would not cross even in a marriage built on desperation. They ate a cold supper of bread and hard cheese in silence, and when the clock on the wall showed 10, Delia lay down on the bed fully clothed, boots off, shawl pulled over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. She did not think she would sleep, but exhaustion pulled her under like deep water, and when she woke in the dark, Lucian was sitting in the chair by the stove, head tipped back, eyes closed, still wearing his badge. The circuit judge arrived on the noon stage 2 days later, a gray-haired man with wire spectacles and a leather satchel that looked older than the town. Delia stood beside Lucian on the steps of the land office and watched the judge climb down, dust rising from his coat with every movement. "Judge Farrell," Lucian said, stepping forward. "Thank you for coming." The judge shook his hand and looked at Delia with sharp, assessing eyes. "And this must be the new Mrs. Thornton. I heard you got married, Sheriff. Fast work." Lucian did not flinch. "My wife is also the town telegraph operator, Your Honor. She has access to all wire traffic in and out of Silver Pass for the past 6 months. If there has been financial irregularity, she can provide an independent record." The judge tilted his head. "Convenient." Delia felt the word like a slap, but she kept her face smooth and said, "Convenient or not, the records exist. I keep a log of every message sent and received, coded and decoded. If you want to compare them to the municipal ledgers, I can provide that." The judge studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "I will want those logs by tomorrow morning." The hearing starts at 9. The hearing room was packed by 8:30. Every bench filled with townspeople who had come to watch the sheriff of Silver Pass defend his name, or lose it. Delia sat beside Lucian in the front row, her hands folded in her lap. The telegraph logs stacked neatly in a leather case at her feet. Across the aisle sat Mayor Whitcomb, a broad man with a florid face and expensive boots. And beside him sat Silas Cade, lean and still, his eyes cold and patient. Delia had seen that look before, the look of a man who knew he held all the cards and was simply waiting for the table to fold. Judge Farrell called the room to order and reviewed the charges. Embezzlement of municipal funds, misappropriation of tax revenue, falsification of financial records, all tied to the sheriff's office account. The mayor's accountant testified first, presenting ledgers that showed irregular deposits and withdrawals under Lucian's authorization. The numbers were damning. The pattern was clear. If Delia had not known better, she would have believed it herself. Then Judge Farrell called her to the stand. She walked to the front of the room with the Telegraph logs in her arms, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and set the stack on the desk. "Your Honor," she said, "these are the complete records of Telegraph traffic in and out of Silver Pass for the past 8 months. I have cross-referenced every wire related to municipal accounts, tax payments, and transfers. There are 7 messages in the official ledgers that do not appear in my logs. 7 messages that were never sent through my office." Judge Farrell leaned forward. "Explain." Delia opened the first log and pointed to the date. On April 14th, the mayor's ledger shows a wire sent to the Territorial Tax Office authorizing a transfer of $800 under Sheriff Thornton's signature. But I have no record of that wire. It was never transmitted through my key. The judge frowned. Could it have been sent from another office? She shook her head. Silver Pass has 1 telegraph line. Every message in or out comes through me. If it is not in my log, it was not sent. It was fabricated after the fact. The room erupted. The judge hammered his gavel twice, and the noise subsided into a tense, crackling silence. Mayor Whitcomb stood, red-faced, and said, "Your Honor, this is absurd. The woman is the sheriff's wife. Of course she will lie for him." Delia turned and looked at the mayor, and her voice came out colder than she had known she could make it. "I was not his wife when these logs were written, Mayor. I have been keeping these records since I took over the Telegraph office 2 years ago, long before I ever spoke to Sheriff Thornton, outside of official business. Every entry is dated and signed. You are welcome to check the ink, the dates, the paper stock." Judge Farrell looked at the logs, then at the mayor, then at Lucian. "Sheriff Thornton, do you have anything to add?" Lucian stood. "Your Honor, I have never authorized a transfer outside of my budgeted salary. I have never signed a document I did not personally review. If there are records that say otherwise, someone forged my signature and backdated the documents. I believe that someone is in this room." Judge Farrell called for a recess and ordered an independent handwriting analysis. By late afternoon, the expert returned with a report that confirmed what Delia's logs had already proven. 4 of the 7 contested documents bore forged signatures. The ink on 2 others had been applied over erased text. The trail led directly back to the mayor's office, and from there to a clerk who broke under questioning and named Silas Cade as the man who had paid him to alter the records. Cade was arrested before sunset. Mayor Whitcomb resigned before the judge could issue a formal censure. Lucian Thornton walked out of the hearing room a free man, his name cleared, his badge still pinned to his chest. Delia walked beside him, exhausted and shaking, and felt the eyes of Silver Pass on them again. But this time, the weight was different. This time it was respect, mixed with caution. The kind of attention people gave to a couple who had just fought a public battle and won. They walked back to the house in silence, the evening light slanting long and gold across the dusty street. Lucian opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter first. Inside, he took off his hat, set it on the table, and turned to face her. "You saved my life today." She shook her head. "I saved both our lives." He smiled, a faint, tired curve of his mouth that she had not seen before. "Fair enough." Then he crossed the room, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a folded envelope. He set it on the table between them. $300. From the Territorial Marshal's office. They paid me a settlement for wrongful accusation and cleared the backlog on my salary. It is yours, every cent. Delia stared at the envelope, her throat tight. "That is your money." He shook his head. "That is our money. You are my wife." The deal was protection and time. You gave me both. This is what I owe you. She picked up the envelope, felt the weight of it, and thought about the ranch deed, about the telegram from Silas Cade, about the 24 days she had left. She thought about the fact that Cade was now in a cell, and his claim on her father's land would not survive a legal challenge. Not now, not with the judge still in town, and the evidence fresh. She thought about the fact that she could walk into the land office tomorrow and settle the debt, clear the deed, and take back the one piece of her father's legacy that mattered. She looked at Lucian and said, "This changes everything." He nodded slowly. "It does. The bargain is fulfilled. You do not have to stay married to me. I can file for an annulment. No one would blame you." She set the envelope down and met his eyes. "What if I do not want an annulment?" Lucian went very still. "Delia, this was a marriage of necessity. You do not owe me anything beyond what we agreed." She took a step closer. "I know. But somewhere between signing that paper and standing in that courtroom, this stopped being just a bargain. You could have walked away a dozen times. You could have taken the money and left me to deal with Cade on my own. You did not." He swallowed, and she watched the line of his throat move. "I gave you my word." She nodded. "And I am giving you mine. I do not want an annulment. I want to see if this can be real." Lucian reached out slowly, carefully, and took her hand, the one that still wore his father's ring. "If we do this," he said, "it will not be easy. This town will watch every move we make. People will assume the worst. They will say you married me for protection, and I married you for an alibi. They will not believe it is real until we prove it." She laced her fingers through his. "Then we prove it." He kissed her then, not the polite ceremonial brush of lips they had skipped at the altar, but a real kiss, slow and deliberate, and full of all the things they had not said in the days since they had spoken vows in a cold chapel. When he pulled back, his eyes were clearer than she had seen them, the exhaustion replaced by something that looked like hope. "We do this right," he said. "No more bargains. No more conditions. Just you and me figuring it out." She smiled. The first real smile she had allowed herself since the telegram arrived. Just you and me. The next morning, Delia walked into the land office with $300 and the deed to Cottonwood Ranch. The clerk processed the payment without comment, stamped the deed clear, and handed it back to her with a receipt. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket, feeling the weight lift from her chest for the first time in months. When she walked out onto the street, Lucian was waiting on the steps, hat tipped back, arms crossed, a faint smile on his face. "Done," she said. He nodded. "Good. Now let us go see the ranch. It has been empty too long." They rode out to Cottonwood Ranch on a clear morning, the sky wide and blue, the wind carrying the scent of sage and dry grass. The house was smaller than Delia remembered, the paint faded and peeling, the porch steps sagging on one side. But the barn still stood, and the cottonwoods her mother had planted 30 years ago still lined the creek, their leaves turning gold in the early autumn light. Lucian dismounted and walked the perimeter, checking the fence posts, the well, the roof. Delia stood in the doorway and looked at the empty rooms, at the dust on the floor and the cobwebs in the corners, and felt something settle in her chest. This was hers now. Theirs. Lucian came back and stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "It needs work." She nodded. "A lot of work." He smiled. "Good thing we have time." They spent the next 3 weeks riding out to the ranch every Sunday, patching the roof, clearing the barn, scrubbing the floors, replacing broken window glass. Delia learned that Lucian could swing a hammer with the same steady precision he used to defuse a saloon fight. And Lucian learned that Delia could negotiate with a carpenter over lumber prices with the same sharp clarity she had used to dismantle the mayor's case. They worked side by side in the sun and the wind, and slowly the house began to look like a place people could live. On the 4th Sunday, they brought a table and 2 chairs from town, and Delia made coffee on the old stove while Lucian nailed down the loose porch boards. They sat together on the steps as the sun went down, drinking coffee that tasted like dust and victory. And Lucian said, "I think we should move out here. Make this our home." Delia looked at him, at the man she had married in desperation and chosen in trust, and said, "I think so too." They moved to Cottonwood Ranch at the end of October, bringing everything they owned in a single wagon load. Delia kept the Telegraph office in town, riding in 3 days a week to handle messages and keep the line open. Lucian kept his badge and his territory, but he built a small office in the barn so he could work from the ranch when the roads were bad or the weather turned. They fell into a rhythm, learning each other's habits and routines, learning how to share space and silence and the small domestic negotiations of a real marriage. Delia discovered that Lucian sang under his breath when he was mending tack, old trail songs with no particular tune. Lucian discovered that Delia kept a journal in careful cipher and read it aloud to him at night when she felt like sharing. They argued once over whether to buy chickens or fix the fence first. They compromised and did both. It was ordinary and hard, and nothing like the desperate bargain they had started with. Winter came early that year, sharp and cold, and the first snow fell on a Tuesday in late November. Delia woke to find the world outside their window transformed, the prairie white and silent, the cottonwoods heavy with frost. Lucian was already up, stoking the stove, coffee brewing in the battered pot they had brought from town. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and joined him by the fire, and he handed her a cup without a word. They stood together, watching the snow fall through the window, and she felt his arms settle around her shoulders, steady and warm. "This is real now," she said quietly. He nodded. "It has been real for a while." She leaned into him, and he pulled her closer, and they stayed like that while the coffee cooled and the snow piled higher on the porch. Spring arrived with mud and green shoots, and the news that Silas Cade had been sentenced to 5 years for fraud and embezzlement. The town began to settle, the gossip shifting from scandal to ordinary business. Delia and Lucian became part of Silver Pass's fabric, the sheriff and his wife, the couple who had fought for each other and won. People stopped asking questions. They stopped watching so closely. And in the quiet moments, when Delia sat at her telegraph key sending messages across the territories, or when Lucian rode patrol through the high country, checking fence lines and water rights, they carried with them the knowledge that what they had built was not perfect, but it was theirs, and it was real, and it was enough. One evening in early summer, Delia found Lucian standing in the barn doorway, looking out at the land. She walked up beside him and slipped her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He smiled, the tired lines around his eyes softer now. "I am thinking that a year ago I thought I would lose everything. My name, my job, my future. And now I have this." He gestured at the ranch, at the house, at her. "I have you." She squeezed his hand. "We have each other. That is what we bargained for." He turned to face her, and his expression was serious and open. "No. We bargained for survival. This, what we have now, we chose." She nodded, her throat tight. "And I would choose it again." He kissed her then, slow and sure, the kind of kiss that said forever without needing words. The town of Silver Pass threw a summer dance at the end of June, and for the first time since their hurried chapel wedding, Delia and Lucian walked into a public gathering as a couple who had nothing to prove. They danced under the lantern strung between the cottonwoods, her hand in his arm around her waist, moving to the sound of fiddle and accordion, and the laughter of neighbors who had finally stopped wondering whether the marriage was real. When the music slowed, Lucian pulled her close and said into her hair, "I never thought I would get this. A home, a partner, a life that feels like mine." She tipped her head back to look at him. "You deserve it. We both do." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had taken months to earn, the kind that came from trust and work and the slow, steady building of something worth keeping. "I know," he said. "I know that now." They left the dance early, riding back to the ranch under a sky crowded with stars. The house was dark when they arrived, the windows reflecting moonlight, the porch steps solid under their feet. Delia lit the lamp in the main room, while Lucian saw to the horses. And when he came inside, she was standing by the table, her shawl draped over a chair, her face soft in the amber light. He crossed the room and took her hands, and she looked up at him with eyes that had seen desperation and fear and survival, and had come through all of it to something better. "This is home," she said. He nodded. "This is home." Months turned into seasons, and seasons turned into years. The ranch prospered. The telegraph office stayed busy. Lucian's reputation as a fair and steady lawman spread beyond Silver Pass, and Delia's skill with codes and records made her a quiet but essential part of the territory's communications network. They built a life that was ordinary and extraordinary at once, filled with hard work and small joys, and the kind of partnership that came from choosing each other every day. They argued over whether to plant corn or beans in the west field. They laughed over burned biscuits and broken harnesses. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down over the prairie, and talked about everything and nothing. One autumn afternoon, Delia rode into town to pick up a shipment at the freight office and found a letter waiting for her at the telegraph desk. It was from the territorial governor's office, an official envelope with a wax seal. She opened it carefully and read the short message inside. Mrs. Thornton, we are pleased to inform you that your husband has been appointed Deputy Territorial Marshal, effective immediately. His exemplary service and integrity have earned him this honor. Please convey our congratulations. She folded the letter, tucked it into her pocket, and rode back to the ranch faster than was strictly safe. Lucian was in the barn when she arrived, mending a saddle, and she thrust the letter at him without preamble. He read it twice, then looked at her with something like disbelief. This is real. She grinned. It is real. You earned it. He set the letter down and pulled her into his arms, and she felt his heart beating steady and strong against her cheek. We earned it, he said. Both of us. They celebrated that night with a simple supper and a bottle of whiskey Lucian had been saving for a reason he had not yet named. Delia poured 2 glasses, and they sat together at the table, the lamp casting shadows on the walls, the house quiet around them. To new beginnings, she said, raising her glass. He touched his glass to hers. To the best bargain I ever made. She laughed. I thought we agreed this was not a bargain anymore. He smiled. It is not. But it started as one. And I will always be grateful for that. For the fact that you were desperate enough and brave enough to ask. She reached across the table and took his hand. And I will always be grateful that you were honorable enough to say yes. They drank, and the whiskey burned warm and clean, and outside the window the prairie stretched dark and wide under a sky full of stars. Years later, when people asked how they met, Delia and Lucian would smile and give the simple answer. We got married. And when people pressed for details, for the story behind the story, they would say only that it had been the right choice at the right time. And that sometimes the best things in life come from desperate decisions made in good faith. They never talked about the telegram, or the frame-up, or the marriage certificate signed in a cold chapel on a desperate afternoon. Those details belonged to them, private and sacred. The foundation of a life they had built together from nothing but need and trust, and the stubborn refusal to give up. They had started as strangers bound by necessity. They had become partners bound by choice. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered.